We've been very light on werewolf movies over the last number of years. Not that they were ever the biggest things going, but if you look back at the 80s and see how many werewolf movies came out and compare that to today, we really don't have many. Personally speaking, out of all of them that we have, my favorite is honestly still The Wolfman from 1941, in large part due to Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance, but also because there's just like this great fabled feel to the movie. It's beautifully shot, it's very heavily stylized with this dense, dark, gothic atmosphere. The 2010 remake isn't terrible, but there's too many things that bother me about it to really say that I love it or anything like that. Watchable, yes, but nowhere near what I'd hoped for. That brings us to the latest attempt at reviving this iconic horror film, with Leigh Whannel's Wolfman, which released in January of 2025 after quite a long while of production hell. Whannel wasn't even attached to the project when it was initially greenlit back in 2014, with various filmmakers being juggled around, including one with Ryan Gosling, behind and in front of the camera, which definitely would have been interesting to see. Apparently, Dwayne Johnson had been considered for the lead at one point. Alright. Universal had kind of gotten hung up on bringing back the Universal monster movies, with the Dark Universe being like the shared cinematic universe, as everything needs to be, of course. And then when The Mummy came out in 2017 and no one saw it except people who said it was bad, they basically dumped the entire idea. Must have been quite committed to it. I wonder if their motivations were artistic or commercial. Anyway, sort of serendipitously, it was Whannel's remake of The Invisible Man that wound up causing Universal to seek out a little bit of a looser model for their monster movies and not restrict them to a shared universe. I haven't seen that in a couple years, but I remember really liking it, so I can understand why that is. He wound up signing on and wrote a treatment for the film with his wife Corbett Tuck, but eventually parted from the project due to scheduling issues, and Derek Cianfrance was brought on to direct the one with Ryan Gosling. They'd worked together on The Place Beyond the Pines prior to this, which is one of my all-time favorite movies, and I am forever curious to see what they would have done with the material, but they didn't finish getting it all ready for production until the writer's strike started, so that pushed things over the line once again, and they parted ways with the project. This thing was in development hell, bouncing between different writers and directors and rewrites and Dwayne "The Rock" Johnsons, until finally Whannel came back after Cianfrance departed, and that's when it actually happened. 11 years between being greenlit and released. And while that's a lot of time to make a great movie, it's not so much when even figuring out what the hell they were shooting was as messy of a process as this it was. I've been a fan of Leigh Whannel for a very long time. The dude had a hand in some of the most important horror films of the 21st century, and he also made the 2025 film Wolfman. This movie is a very strange feeling watch because there are parts of it that are genuinely amazing and feel as well executed as they could be, but the issue is that so much of the story feels like we're literally seeing that treatment that he'd initially written before there was an actual screenplay. We have all of these ideas being toyed with in the film, touching on subjects of generational abuse, degenerative illness, familial connections, but almost all of it exists solely in the dialogue, much in the way that I'd imagine you'd find in the first draft of a script, and which subsequent drafts would infuse more into other elements of the film to make them really come to life. There are moments in this movie where it's hitting every note that it clearly wanted to, and then there are others where it's so clear that this didn't have nearly enough time in the oven, so let's talk about why that is. If you're familiar with Whannel's take on The Invisible Man, it shouldn't be any surprise that his Wolfman is really only connected to its source material through the title itself and some references for fans of the original. He seems to like taking the basic concept of a film and doing something completely different with it, which is something that I actually do really appreciate. This is only a remake in the loosest possible sense of the term, and honestly, at this point, it's so disconnected from the original that I wonder if it would have made sense to just have this be its own thing entirely. Some of the themes are reflected in this version, such as the deep fear of hurting people around you, but that's not necessarily something that's unique to the Wolfman. It kind of just comes with the territory of a story about someone turning into a murderous beast against their will. The only other thing I noticed was that the design for the Wolfman itself does have some of the same sort of like underbite that the one from the original does, All of that being said, for the approach that this film took, it does make more sense for this creature to be referred to as a Wolfman instead of a werewolf, as that's a much more accurate reflection of what this thing actually is. It's really not a wolf at all, and the malady isn't treated as any sort of supernatural curse here or anything. It's just a really fast-acting and intense infection. That being said, there are also references to other werewolf films in here. The big one being that the daughter's name is Ginger, which is a nice nod to Ginger Snaps. I figured I'd get that all out of the way before moving on, since again, this really is its own movie, and I want to just talk about it on its own terms. Wolfman 2025 is a movie that's largely inseparable from its themes that it's exploring. And that's not because those core themes are a huge driving force for the elements of the story, it's because the movie will constantly remind you what its central idea is.
You're so scared of your kids getting scars, you become the thing that scars.
There are a number of things going on here, like I mentioned earlier, but the big point of focus is on the generational abuse, the trauma that comes from having an abusive parent, and how that impacts the way that a victim will then go on to treat their children. Cyclical curses like that of the werewolf make a lot of sense as a storytelling tool for this kind of thing, but man, I really hate to say this, but the movie does a terrible job of expressing that effectively. Again, not because it's not clear that this is what they're touching on, because it's excessively clear. It's that the actual crafting of this exploration is so flat and underbaked. The film opens with a sequence of Blake, our main character, as a child living with his father in their isolated home. We get a taste of a very regimented life that's clearly a result of his father being in the military before they head out into the woods to go hunting, in what's easily one of the strongest scenes of the whole movie. I think part of why this movie irks me is because it has moments that are just fantastic, that aren't allowed to feel entirely satisfying because they're smushed in the middle of a rather anemic film. The atmosphere through this opening sequence, and honestly a lot of the movie, is fantastic. There's a really earthy feel to it all, with the opening shots of nature connecting the story immediately to the sort of animalistic side of things, and once we're out here, you can damn near feel the air in these woods. They do a really great job of letting the natural ambiance of the space speak for itself without overly intrusive music, even when you'd sometimes expect to hear it, and that helps in making this such an immersive opening. While out on their hunting trip, Blake runs off after a deer and spots our first look at the titular Wolfman. Hi, Larry. I love that there isn't a jump scare sound here. There's no change in the soundscape whatsoever. It's just this eerie silence as the thing comes into view. They're chased into a deer blind, and that fantastic build-up continues with this awesome moment where we can see the breath of the beast floating up through the air just over the lip, again making the space feel very cold and earthy and alive. And the thing is distracted by the sound of a deer, which results in yet another great detail where when they look over, the deer is already torn to shreds, which cranks things up because of how quickly we know this happened. The cold open wraps up with Blake's father on a radio to a nearby house, talking about having found this rumored creature and how he's going to go hunt it to protect Blake. And that's when we cut to the modern day. Now, this is all that we see of Blake's father. He's a strict dude without a doubt, but I don't really think there was a moment in anything that we saw that depicted him as an abusive and bad father. He got loud, he grabbed Blake, he probably shouldn't have done that. But it's important to remember that they're living in bear country here, and Blake does need to understand how to navigate the land safely. That's why we also have a moment early on where Blake asks about a mushroom and gets told not to eat it as it's a death cap, and his father gets heated with him because Blake isn't able to repeat back what he told him.
This place is beautiful, it's also dangerous. You can survive if you know exactly what to do.
So here's where Wolfman starts to bother me. What we've seen of Blake's father is that he's trying to teach his son how to stay safe in the wilderness in which they live, prepare him for the time when he's no longer around to protect him, and then risks his own life hunting a creature in the woods because he doesn't want it to hurt his son. But he gets loud, and so now the movie paints him as an abuser and uses a literal monster as a thematic stand-in. There's no point where Blake talks about being hit by his dad, and we never see any indication of this happening, and it's not even like we see any wildly unreasonable reactions from his father here. So when we get to the point where the movie starts treating him like he was a shitty father who traumatized his son into having angry outbursts, it feels so insanely forced and completely unearned. I'm not saying that his dad was perfect, but he's nowhere near bad enough from what we see or are told to warrant the way the movie frames him later on. The father that Blake describes at the table is not the same one who we saw during the cold open. The problem of the movie not effectively displaying character traits that it wants to use as storytelling devices is not limited to Blake's father either. It's also a huge issue with his wife Charlotte, who we hear talking about how she feels like she can't connect with her daughter, isn't a good mother, and doesn't know if she has it in her to fix this. And yet the movie barely does anything with that. By the time this conversation comes up, we've seen literally zero hint that she's having any of these problems, which means that our introduction to the core struggle with this character is through her just telling the audience about it, instead of having it set up through more cohesive means. Granted, they do a little bit with this later on, which I was glad to see, where she's sitting quietly in a room after they got chased into the house by the beast and saying nothing to Ginger, but then Blake comes in and comforts her. We have some of these moments that come later, but because the movie already just told us what's going on, it doesn't land the same as it otherwise would. This is especially the case as not long after that conversation, we see them all in a car together and Charlotte is doing a perfectly fine job of interacting and connecting with Ginger. There's no sense of the struggle that the movie is forcefully trying to tell us is there, and yet the literal last scene of the movie is meant to land that beat. So because of how it's handled up to that point, it falls painfully flat. These things are all there, but this is what I meant when I said it feels like so much of this story exists solely in dialogue and isn't actually infused into the events. They tell us that Blake's father was abusive, but we don't see that. They tell us that Charlotte is feeling disconnected from her daughter without a single instance of that happening until quite a while later. It's almost worse than the movie not showing us any of this at all, because here we have moments that feel like they're directly contradicting what the movie is telling us it wants to be. Then when it comes to Blake wanting to be a better father to Ginger than his dad was to him, it's one of the most on-the-nose portrayals of this you can imagine. We have this moment right after the time jump where Ginger is being extremely unsafe around a busy street, and then he loses his shit on her for it and then feels bad, and we get our first taste of one of the most overbearing motifs I've seen in a long while.
So what's my job?
To keep your daughter safe.
This comes up constantly. And it's another way that the movie shows itself completely incapable of expressing its themes without pushing them front and center through dialogue alone. There is one detail that I actually do really like here though, and that's that this dude gets up in Ginger's face when she hops down right in front of him by accident, and he acts like a maniac about it. The reason that I like this is because it helps to show that the more aggressive side of Blake is something that's kind of like buried below the surface. And having this guy amp up the situation and his adrenaline tenfold in order to pull this out of him when he lays into Ginger is a genuinely effective way of displaying where that anger lies inside of him. But the big problem is that once again, this feels like a theme they wanted for the story, so they just threw this scene in here, and then we never see a single other instance of something like this happening. So we get zero notion that it's something that Blake is actually struggling with. Yes, he was overly aggressive with Ginger without a doubt, but having one isolated instance of him getting excessively hot-headed after getting the shit scared out of him by his daughter being this unsafe around a busy street, and then having an insane guy amp him up even further, is not indicative of Blake being someone who struggles with shaking a generational cycle of abuse. It's one mistake. Every other scene we get with him, he is a perfectly sweet, caring, and thoughtful father. So once again, we have another string that the movie wants us to be invested in, but does next to no work in actually earning. That's not to mention how forced the entire scene feels, as Ginger isn't shown to be reckless in other situations. In fact, she feels excessively mature, which I will get to. None of this feels natural whatsoever, from her going up there to not listening to her father, to the ridiculous reaction from the guy who goes at Ginger, to Blake's outburst following it. I can't buy a single moment of any of this. I want to talk more about Ginger, because one thing that always really bothers me in movies, especially when they're trying to be serious and explore heavy topics, is when kids are written in a way that feel absolutely nothing like a kid actually would be. Her reactions to a lot of what happens in the movie feel way too subdued, but the big issues that I have with how this character was written have to do with the unbelievably contrived conclusions that she comes to. If a child's father turned into something like this, at least the way that I see it, they'd probably just go into denial and be absolutely fucking terrified and stay far away. They wouldn't walk straight up to them and repeat the whole "what am I thinking" motif like this is some poorly written soap opera. The way she acts around Blake after the infection takes hold bothers me pretty consistently, but the thing that drives me absolutely nuts is during the climax of the film where they're chased into the same deer blind that Blake and his father were hiding at the start of the movie, which is a nice touch that ties itself into the cyclical nature of the themes the movie's dealing with. However, when Blake pops his head up, what Ginger says almost completely kills any possible sense of immersion that had been built up to that point.
He wants this to be over.
Mother, father has become the very monster which he so feared, which his father implanted in him through his dark tendencies, and he can see that he is falling into the same fate. We must shoot father in the face, mother. Not a fucking chance in hell would a kid A, read that from what's going on, or B, accept that their father is looking for some homegrown maid literally less than 24 hours after he was infected. The writing here is just bad. This is no hate to the actor whatsoever, and if you throw shit at a child actor for being a child, just stop doing that. Don't be goofy. But no part of me buys this character for even a second because of how shallow, forced, and unbelievably written Ginger is. Now we'll loop back to the ending, but I'm just going to balance things out somewhat here and talk about the things that I not only think the movie did well, but the things that I genuinely loved about Wolfman. I talked a little bit about this in regards to the cold open, but the atmosphere in this movie is fantastic. Again, it all feels very airy and earthy thanks to the color palette, the framing that allows spaces to breathe, and the really effective sound design that goes a long way in establishing a strong sense of space throughout the whole thing. The score in the film from Benjamin Wallfisch is very effective in its attempts to prop up that looming darkness and tragedy in the story, but the movie also often opts to have no score accompany moments where you'd expect it to, and that makes it so that during some of the genuinely disturbing scenes, there's no safety that can be found in a dramatic score giving you any distance from the horror of what you're watching. It's not a particularly memorable soundtrack, but it's one that serves its purpose and knows when it's needed, and almost more importantly here, when it's not. Aesthetically, there really is a lot to love with this movie. It doesn't necessarily relish in the kind of imagery that you'd often expect to see from a werewolf movie with dense, foggy countrysides and bright, brilliant, cold full moons, but all of those things are there in a more naturalistic way, which is nicely reflective of how the movie approaches its less supernatural take on the werewolf. The camera work is really great, and they did a phenomenal job with the lighting in particular, not just in the sense that the movie looks really dark and atmospheric, but also because of how they go about handling moments where darkness can be used as an advantage for Blake as the infection takes hold of him, and he gains the ability to see in the dark much better than anyone else can. There's this amazing moment early on in his infection where he goes downstairs while Charlotte is attempting to call for help on a radio, and we first see the sequence through his perspective, so it seems like there's more than enough light down here, and then we slowly fade into Charlotte's perspective and see that outside of the small light she has by her, the space is in complete and utter darkness. The reason that I love this so much is because it illustrates in a really haunting way how much of an advantage Blake is gaining over his family when it comes to navigating around what's very often a dark house. So while he hasn't yet become violent or anything, it sets up that sense of tension and puts us on edge for the inevitable switch that we know is coming. On that note, easily the best thing about Werewolf is the section of the story where we watch while the infection takes over Blake. I have my problems with how this was built up to, largely just because they have a character here who acts insanely creepy while Blake for some reason sees absolutely nothing wrong with him, despite us just being shown how hot-headed he gets and how quick he comes to his daughter's defense, and then this dude is just killed off, meaning he was only really there for an early death and to try and establish some discomfort before we've come in contact with the Wolfman. I do at least appreciate that he set up by having Blake's father mention to someone else on the radio that he should also want to protect his son, and that son is who we see here, which is nice, but he's a pretty pointless addition. That aside, it's during his directions to Blake's house when the attack from the Wolfman comes and leads to his death and Blake's infection. One of the main themes that was in Whannell's mind while he was writing this was degenerative illnesses, which was something very close to his personal life. Leigh tragically lost a friend of his to ALS, and I can't imagine how difficult that must have been to witness. This side of the film feels so razor sharp and well realized, and it's so accurately depicted the feeling of watching someone close to you fall ill at a rapid pace and lose themselves while you sit back unable to do anything about it, just lost in the horror and confusion. This was done perfectly, and it's not surprising to learn that this was the part of the story that was the most personal for Whannel. While I clearly have a lot of problems with this movie, this is not one of them, and I actually think it's some of the strongest material I saw in a horror movie in 2025. It just doesn't fully land because of how flat the rest of the thing wound up. There was even a scene cut from the film that further illustrated Whannel's connection with this, where Blake visits his mother, who's deep into a fight with ALS, and while I would have liked to see this, I do think that the movie was already too unfocused on what it wanted to do, and including that would have only worsened the issue. The problem that I have with all of this is that having the werewolf curse be an infection that's representative of neurodegenerative illnesses like ALS, it conflicts with the movie also trying to use the werewolf as a way to represent the inner monster and generational trauma caused by abusive parenting. It's a little difficult to have the thing embody these at the same time because the angle from which you look at the thematic purpose of the Wolfman through is the complete opposite depending on which theme you're latching onto in a given moment. It just feels weird to me to have it be used to represent a loved one falling into a neurodegenerative illness, while also being used to represent someone being abusive. All of that said, shedding any dissonance where that's concerned, this shit is amazing, largely because the emotional side of watching Charlotte in particular sit hopelessly by while this happens is realized so well. You get this really potent sense of panic as she watches Blake decline at a horrifying rate, and the way that Julia Garner plays this character is trying to fight off that complete terror so that she can try and figure out what she may be able to do to help adds so much to these sequences. She's such a good actor.
And, you can't talk,
Easily the most effective scare of the movie, in my opinion, is when she sees how much worse his cut has gotten in an alarmingly short period of time, and he begins to violently scratch at the wound and tear it all up before running off to the corner to make things even worse. And Blake's standing in the corner here while he does this, and Charlotte just standing back in horror and watching it all unfold while paralyzed by it all, is easily the moment that got under my skin the most. It's a genuinely disturbing and sickening and upsetting scene, and they also did some stuff with the more tragic side of this whole situation that I really appreciated. The best example of this to me is when she's talking to Blake and telling him that she loves him, but he can't understand what she's saying, and then we get his perspective of it. He's also trying to say that he loves her, and she too can't understand him. That disconnection in the family isn't just meant to be between Charlotte and Ginger, it's something that's established as a struggle for Blake and Charlotte as well, and this quick scene is just a deeply sad and beautifully well-crafted expression of that, made even more so when you take the context of what inspired this story into account. There's this like 15-minute chunk right here in the movie that is easily the most well-realized and executed section of the whole thing. Honestly, one of the coolest moments I had in a theater in 2025 was this scene where Blake is talking to Charlotte and Ginger and they're just staring at him blankly without responding with these deeply worried expressions on their faces. I was sitting there for a moment and then it's just, oh shit, he's definitely like just mumbling right now. It's disturbing. It was made so much more interesting because they decided to play it from Blake's perspective and demonstrate how he's not even aware that anything is wrong with him at this point, while his family stares back at him in horror and confusion. And that's a concept that just immediately made my chest tighten up and hit me on a really deep level. Then we have some of the less thematically rich, but still cool depictions of what's happening to him, specifically with the sequence of him thinking that he's hearing the Wolfman upstairs and goes to find that there's a spider in the closet, and the insanely loud noises he's been hearing were a result of his senses altering and seeking out prey. It's a little odd, considering there would absolutely be other animals and bugs around, and it's not to mention that all the other noises in the woods, but for some reason it's only this spider that gets louder and only for this one scene, but I'm not gonna hold that against the movie since it's just a really damn cool reveal. Now, in terms of how this movie handles itself from a werewolf perspective, It's important to note that because this is a movie wearing the Wolfman name, it's not to be expected that we'll be getting a traditional werewolf, and instead something that still has human characteristics. The design they went with is I guess it's okay. I don't think it looks anywhere near as cool as the design from the original movie or the 2010 remake, but as something that's approaching the material from a new angle, I think that Blake's look when he transforms is serviceable enough and more closely connects itself to the thematic side of this story. The transformation is pretty damn lacking, unfortunately, happening very quickly and with some close-up shots of some cool effects, but it's wild to me that we still have nothing that even comes close to an American Werewolf in London in terms of this sort of thing. They did do a good job of making the transformation feel extremely painful, and I like the detail of him cracking his own jaw, but there's nothing here that feels special or unique. It also comes at a point where Blake has already been transformed a lot, so it kind of seems like they weren't even going to dedicate like one big transformation scene and we're doing something more gradual instead. But then you just get one that pushes him over the edge. I don't know, it feels like an afterthought. So much so that they released the whole fucking scene before the movie was even out. So it kind of seems like they didn't even care about this sequence and only had it there out of some self-imposed necessitation of a dedicated and painful transformation scene because it's a werewolf movie. It's better than not having it all, I guess, but it does leave a lot to be desired. Now, Blake is, of course, not the only Wolfman lurking around here, and well, suffice it to say, when they revealed what this thing would look like before the movie came out, basically everyone immediately went to try and find some cope in the thought that this wouldn't actually be what the Wolfman looked like in the final thing, and yet here we are. Granted, it looks better under the right lighting and in the context of a solid enough jump scare, but I definitely don't think that this is the best design we could have had. So the whole reason that Blake came out to his father's home is because he received a letter officially declaring his father dead after being missing for a long time. And so he needs to go there to sort out some things and figures it would be good for his family to come so that they could reconnect. With the inconclusive information on his father and the fact that we know he went out chasing after the Wolfman after what happened during the opening scene, I think it's fairly obvious that the Wolfman that they face off against in the house is Blake's father. And yet the movie plays that reveal after Blake kills him while defending his family like it's some big twist. They focused pretty heavily on his tattoo at the start so that they could do the same with his transformed state. And this is kind of just a baffling moment because it really feels like the movie thinks this is going to come as some surprise, whereas I feel like most people at this point are already watching the movie with this in mind well before the movie points it out. It's just another idea that feels like it's still in the very early stages and needed to be ironed out over script rewrites and refined to make it feel impactful, but it just completely flops because of how obvious it was, especially when we take into consideration that the whole goddamn movie has been very heavy-handed about its themes of generational abuse and trauma. Okay, ending time. I already mentioned that bit with Ginger summoning the wisdom to read into her father's buried and sickened wishes and accept his death at the same age where she'd normally be summoning demons with Labubu dolls, so we'll go past that and straight to the very end. It's pretty clear that I'm not the biggest fan of this movie, but there was enough that I thought they were absolutely nailing that I was hoping there could be some conclusion after Blake's death that would stick the landing and make the movie feel worth all the nonsense. And then it just suddenly ended. I was properly shocked when the credits came up because it was just, wait, that's it? Blake's father stood here looking at this view with him when he was a kid, so now Charlotte does the same with Ginger, and then it's over. On top of how completely flat so much of this feels, this ending just solidified that feeling by using a piece of imagery that is gorgeous without a doubt, but is so disconnected from the purpose of this story that it winds up feeling completely empty. This is only full circle in the most superficial way. We have all of these ideas running through the movie, and then by the end, it feels like none of them saw their way through. Is the message that if you have an abusive parent and yelled at your kid once that you can never recover? I'm not one to excessively hold a movie to having, every beat match with its themes, but that ending feels like it was entirely designed around theme, and yet feels completely counterintuitive to the way they'd been exploring it up to that point. If it's about generational abuse and Blake was actually breaking the cycle, this feels completely out of place. Granted, it's more fitting through the lens of the neurodegenerative illnesses the movie was exploring, but again, these two central themes are at odds with each other, and nothing feels like it hits the right notes. Wolfman 2025 is a movie that I think has a lot of genuinely great stuff in it. Enough, in fact, that I can easily say I will watch the movie again for its atmosphere and incredible 15 or 20 minute chunk of Blake's infection setting in, but the storytelling here is so messy and unfocused. And this is an example of a movie that really can't be disconnected from its themes and just enjoyed as a simple werewolf movie because of how on the nose they are about that material and how little they deliver on the promise of the werewolf stuff. Every emotional beat outside of that amazing section falls completely flat, and the story feels so utterly empty by the time we reach the conclusion that I was shocked when it was over. It's so sudden and unsatisfying. What sucks about this is that I think the performances are actually very good. Pretty much all of my criticisms in terms of characters underreacting to certain things come down to the writing, not the actors. To be very clear, I still have a ton of love and respect for Leigh Whannel. He's one of the most important and influential people working in the horror space in the 21st century, and he's made some movies that I think are genuinely fantastic, but this one feels like it needed so much more time given to the script before it went further. The production value is great, the practical effects are awesome, and result in some really gnarly moments, but it's that goddamn script that feels like the unfortunate result of the movie's development hell and constant hot potato that really kills the movie. Not without its values, but that sense of pointlessness by the end really undercuts so much of what I did enjoy about it. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.